Okay, guys, we are back with the fourth installment of the Red Orchestra 2 SDK tutorial series, covering a few more basic things here, unique to the Red Orchestra 2 SDK, not just Unreal Engine stuff. Had a couple requests after the last video, so I'll try to cover those. And as always, if you have anything more specific or something doesn't make sense, feel free to add a comment, and if I can't explain it in the comments, I will gladly cover it in another video. The first thing I want to cover, though, something that's common in nearly every single map in the game, both Rising Storm and Red Orchestra, are trenches. And trenches have a couple unique challenges, but once you get going with trenches, they're fairly simple. The first thing we're going to do is we'll search for a trench mesh in the content browser. As you can see, I've got mine in list view because for whatever reason my SDK was getting really boggy. But we can switch back to the thumbnail view. For this little demonstration, I'm going to use the very basic straight 128 Unreal Unit long trench, which is probably off to the side here. Here we go. Whoops. Right here. Trench straight 128. And if you really want to know where that is, it's in the Mamayev props package. But I'm just going to select it there in the content browser. I'm going to pick a random open spot here on the map, and I'm just going to hold down S and left click. So that puts it down. As you can see, that's not going to work because it's in the middle of the terrain. So as I alluded to in a previous video, we'll use the terrain tool. And then if you select this visibility selection here, it's like looks like a black hole or whatever. You're going to click that. I typically had a good habit. I select the smallest brush for it, although I don't really think it makes a difference which one you select. Strength isn't going to matter. Now when what we're going to do is hold down Control, just like we're going to paint the terrain or raise the terrain, but instead of it raising, now it's actually going to hide or delete a square of the terrain. But as you can see, when I left click on there, I get some massive hole, and that's not going to work for this trench. And because the reason this is happening is because we have the terrain set on just the default tessellation, which if you don't have trenches or openings in the terrain, maybe this works for you. It is a little big as far as like the way the material scales and things. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click while we hold Control, and that'll put it back. You can always bring it back and hide it, unhide it, whatnot. But what we're going to do is come over here and hit this tessellation increase button, which is in the terrain tools as well. So I'm going to click that. It's going to give me a warning. Usually you want to kind of set this up early on in your map. If you lay down a trench or something, or an opening in the terrain, and then you go back and adjust this later, it's going to screw up all your openings, and it's going to make a lot of extra work for you. So I'm going to accept the warning, and as you can see, the scale of the terrain changed a little bit. There is a little bit more tiling if you get far out. That can be addressed later with just some basic level design tricks and approaches. We'll try the left click Control again. It's still a little big. It's wider than the trench, so that's still not going to work. So now I'm going to click it one more time, and as you'll notice, the trenches that are found in the vanilla maps or the vanilla packages, usually you'd want to click increase twice, and you're going to get the right size. So this will be the right size here. And now it's a little crooked, but what we're going to do now is cover how to place the trench on the grid, as they call it. Okay, we've got our tessellation set to where we want to work with it with the trenches, and we've placed down that very basic 128 UU trench. The next step we're going to do is align the trench to the grid. It makes it a little bit easier to work with when you're opening up holes in the terrain and so forth. So what we're going to do for this is, the best thing I like to do is go to the overhead view. Make sure your terrain is turned on. If you're not seeing the terrain, it's this light gray. Tap T to unhide it or hide it. Same thing, if you don't see your meshes in this top view, you can tap W and it will likely appear. Same thing, you can hide them with the same key. But if you look closely, I'm going to hide it for a minute. Right here is our deleted section or patch of the terrain. There has no cross line here. So what I want to do is just get my trench centered in there. I can do it by hand. I don't think I covered this in an earlier video. If you're finding that when you're trying to move things, or you can have a mesh selected and tap the arrow keys for really fine movements, but if you find that the meshes are jumping way far and you can't get small movements, you need to adjust your scale over here in this little drop down. And the snaps is what it is, but I put all mine down to as low as they can go. Rotation, your scaling, and then your the dragging that we're doing here. So I prefer to have it as small as it can go, simply because I like to have real fine control over mine. So if I toggle T, you can see the edge of the terrain, and if I get it aligned perfectly, it kind of disappears. That's how I know it's right. And then same thing, we want to get it kind of centered, which we can see with the background bar there. If I can get it just right, I think that should be it. Yeah, that's it. So this is perfectly centered now in this hole on the X and Y axis, not necessarily Z. And then with the Z axis, you have a little bit more room to play with, because the trench is meant to kind of sit below the terrain a little bit there. So okay, so we've got our trench aligned to the grid. Now there's a few ways to do what we'll do next. I'll just show you the way I typically do it. We can pre-make a hole here, or we can do it after the fact too. What you can do is, if you want, you can place down another one of these by holding S, then go into this view up here and just, align it, tweak it however you want it to be, and kind of manually make sure it's straight. And this is all fine and dandy. A lot of times I find little holes and that bothers me or whatever. So you can see one's a little bit higher than the other, and that can all be adjusted. What I prefer to do, and like I said, you can play with this yourself and try whatever you want. If I copy this, alt drag it to the side, it's going to be in the exact same Z position there. It's aligned up and down, and then all I have to do is go in here and I just tap right a little bit till I get it. Now it's perfectly aligned, it's touching, there are no gaps, there are no seams showing or anything like that. So I've got two now. I can do the same thing, and then I just worry about where they meet up. I'm all about, I guess, efficient work, and I hate, you don't want to spend 2 days putting in a trench, and because there's other things we'll need to do, putting in mantle nodes or things like that to be able to climb out of the trench. So this is typically what I do. And then once you get a few in a row or whatnot, I'm going to want to sink this a hair down so it looks a little bit more natural where it meets up with the terrain. And then they have special meshes you'll find over here for the end of the trench and things like that. I won't get into that too much, but here we have a trench end. What I'll show you here, another trick, the alt drag will get you a copy of it, and then rather than placing down this new static mesh, I can go in here, there's several ways you can do this too, but I'll right click on it, and I'm just going to replace this mesh with the one I have selected, the end. And then it's facing the wrong way, but now it too is perfectly aligned. You could go into its properties and turn it 90 degrees if you wanted to, or you could do it manually like that. I kind of eyeballed that one, but the way the grid snaps work, I think it was correct. Let's take a quick peek. We can tell if it's aligned. Yeah, it perfectly aligned up. We'll need to delete that little guy. And now we have a proper trench. You know, this one's straight. You don't really want to curve them and whatnot. But just that quickly, we got that trench down. Everything's perfectly aligned. We don't have silly seams in here, and we're trying to eyeball a bunch of different meshes down on the grid. But that's how I do it. There's other ways to do it. Another, I guess, shortcut is, you know, you find a trench system on another map you like, you could copy it and bring it onto yours if you don't feel like placing down a bunch of trenches, and especially when they start to get winding and whatnot. But that kind of covers the placing of the trenches, and we'll move on to the next step here. Thank you. Okay, these next two things I'm going to cover are kind of similar when you're playing the game, but as far as from a level design standpoint, they're treated a little bit differently by the game itself. The first thing I'll cover real quick, setting up transports. Transports obviously are drivable vehicles, but they're set up a little differently than like a tank would be. A transport is always associated with a player spawn group. I think it's called a player start group actually, but it's a spawn volume. So the vehicles are attached to the spawn volume, and that's why if you notice when you play, the vehicles enable or disable based on where your spawns are. So if you capture an objective and the spawn moves up, then all of a sudden there's a transport spawning there rather than still back at the original spot. So quickest way to do this really isn't all that hard at all, but I'll go over it briefly here. We'll scroll down to our navigation point, which we'll then find in the menu RO Vehicle Factory, which was where you're going to find everything. Some of this stuff is Heroes of the West related, but the vanilla vehicle factories we'll worry about today. I'm going to choose the RO Vehicle Factory Universal Carrier because I haven't even set this map up to do anything with Axis, so we're still just dealing with the allies. I'll place it down near the spawn. You can put it wherever you want. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to place it here. Now this is just kind of a placeholder so you know where it is. Typically, if you have it too low, things like that, sometimes you'll get some collision issues when it tries to spawn. So I usually raise it up and just tap end so it's snapped down to the grid. But we've got that selected now. It's the only vehicle factory on the map. So I'm going to go over to my scene tab, which once you get a bunch of stuff on your map, the scene tab is very helpful. But I'm going to go down to my RO Vehicle Factory UCs. I've only got one on the map. I'm going to select my spawn volume that I want to associate the transport with. I'll click F4 to get its properties up. You can scroll down, or you could just type, start to type vehicle. Linked vehicle factories is what we are interested in. If I select the vehicle factory here in the scene tab, and I just click this green arrow, boom, now it's associated. So what we'll do typically I like to save after this, but once I save here, I'll come back and we'll spawn in. Alright, we spawned in as the Russian commander, and there it is. There's our transport, and we can get in, drive it, switch seats, whatever we want to do. But that's where it will spawn. If I were to drive it out and get it blown up, it would respawn again after a certain period of time. I think that's controlled in the settings for it. But this works the same way for the half tracks on the Axis side, and even with the Bren carrier if you were designing a Western Front map. But these all work the exact same way, and they can be associated with the spawn. You can associate it with two different spawns. So if you had the spawn point were to move up here, but you still wanted your transport to spawn further back, you could certainly have it that way. So that covers the transports. Now we're going to touch on tanks. Okay, tanks are treated by the game more of a role than like this vehicle, this UC vehicle that anyone can jump in. The tanks are a role in itself. It's actually several roles, and each tank in the when you're setting up your team roles and so forth, each tank is its own fire team. And once we get into the world info, I'll show you what that means. But tanks also have their own spawn volumes. They're similar to the RO player start volume, but they're called like RO player tank start volume or something. But we'll place one of those down real quickly. I've got the. We'll just get a new one here. We're just going to place down a very basic spawn volume. I'm going to make it 1,000 by all three ways. That's fine. We will move it back just a hair so it's behind the player spawn, the humans. We've got our builder brush set up here. This looks good. Doesn't really need to be much bigger than that. I'm going to right click on add volumes if you remember this from some of the previous tutorials. Like I said, it's called RO volume player start group tank crew. There you go. That's a mouthful. But that's now what that is. And just like the player volumes, you have to activate them in Kismet. And the other thing we need to place down are our player starts, which right here. You can copy. The player starts are the same for humans and tanks. The only difference is the spawn that they're in. So add a player start here. I like that kind of a top view. If the player starts not inside it, then it won't work. Usually, even if say you only have one tank on the map, I like to give them a few spawns just in case. These are kind of close to each other, but it'll work for our tutorial anyways. And like I said, when we were doing the spawns for the humans, it's good practice just to raise them all up. If I could get this right. I got a new mouse here. I'm not real fond of it, but and then I'm going to click N to snap them back down to the grid and make sure they're high enough off the ground. They're not up floating. Tank spawns are kind of touchy with collision. If I had a tree right here and I went to play with the tank wouldn't spawn. It might crash the map or something. I don't know, but if you looked in your log, you'd see like a collision error with the tank actor trying to spawn. So we've got that set up. Now I'm just going to throw this into Kismet real quick. If you already have a good grasp of this, you could probably skip ahead. But we can enable, just like before, it's a good practice to disable all player start groups at the beginning of the map, just to add a good practice. And well, then we can enable a tank spawn with the same node here as we do our regular spawn, as long as you got it on the right team. So we've got that there now. The only thing left to do are the role selection. So I'll show you where we'll put them. I won't bore you with watching me for a minute straight trying to find all this stuff in the drop down, but what we're going to do is come down to Territories Allies, where we set up our commander role. And we need to set up, we have a squad. We actually have an empty fire team already. I'm just going to make one more fire team. And I'm going to leave the empty one up there. But we are going to, you can title this, this will be a T-34 or whatever. But you're going to have 3 roles in it. All the tanks need 3 roles. And here's where we're going to pick what's going to spawn here. And what we want is a T-34. I mean, we could pick anything we wanted. But we want the T-34 76. If you had a winter map and you wanted the winter skin, all the vanilla tanks have winter variants. So we're just going to spawn with the green T-34. This is more for like a campaign map. I can't remember if we covered this before or not, but vehicle opposing team. So say if we were going to flip this map, obviously we'd want the other team to have a Panzer IV. So we're just going to choose that. whether or not we really care if it's a campaign map or not. But the first role you'll need to pick is the RO, Role Info Axis, just for a basic tank. The Platoon Commander tank is kind of, that's more for maybe like a Goomrak map where you were just having tanks on the map, nothing else. Since this is a combined arms type thing, we are going to pick, whoops, we don't want Axis, RO, Role Info Allies Tank Commander. If I can find it. This hurts my eyes to look at this stuff, but Tank Commander, here we are. We'll pick that, and well, since I got you here, we'll just knock it out. RO Info Tank Commander, Tank Driver, it's kind of convenient, they're all at the very top. And the last thing we need is a whole machine gunner. So we've got Tank Driver, Tank Commander, and now we need the whole machine gunner for the Allies. Oh, here it is. Tank Hull MG. Boom. Alright, that's all we need for the tank. Those are the three necessary roles. And if we wanted another tank, we could copy this one and just make another fire team with these particular, it would copy all of this, and so we'd have two T-34 roles available from the role selection. Simply because I'm paranoid with this computer, I'm going to save it real quick. It's always a good idea to save a lot. It will crash. It's not if, it's when. But let's try this out real quick here. And if all goes right, we can spawn in as the tank commander. So this works the exact same way for both teams' tanks. And just by setting up another fire team, you could have another, that's probably super loud. Sorry about that. Just by setting up another fire team, you can have more tanks, and you can control how many tanks are on the map and so forth, and have different spawns available, just like when you're spawning human players. So that covers spawning a tank role. Okay, the next thing I want to touch on briefly, I won't get too in depth with this, is Recon. And Recon is something I absolutely loathe. I don't mind the Recon itself, but I can't stand putting it on maps. Just a personal opinion, I guess. Typically, what I would recommend, if you're familiar with matinees in UDK, Recon is more or less a specialized, kind of custom-made, pre-done matinee that you just kind of plug into. And that's why it's actually listed as a matinee when you use it in the game. But here I've brought up Fallen Fighters simply because what I typically like to do is copy matinees from some of the vanilla maps. And or if you've ever played any of my maps, you'll notice most of them, the planes fly on a straight path, sometimes a little too slow, but that's because I really it's something I don't enjoy doing, is making the paths for the planes and things like that. And you can do that, and I'll kind of show you real quick how that's done. If you're interested in knowing how to animate the plane and things like that, then you would just need to look up like a Unreal Engine matinee tutorial. There's thousands of them online, but the matinee, you need the main thing you need is where the plane actor is going to be. So here I believe we're looking at the Allied plane here, and in the editor here it's a camera, but when you use it in the game it will transform into a plane. The biplane, I think, is the one the Allies use. But you have the plane. What I would recommend, I'm just going to show you real quick how you would copy the matinee or the Recon from another map. So I'm going to copy the camera, which is the plane, and then I'm also going to copy the matinee itself, and then try to keep the references here as well. So when you're copying things from one map to another, the best thing to do is actually, you can click it in the editor, hit Control-C, this works for most things, and just paste it into a notepad. Okay, so now there's no need for opening up two instances of the editor. That was kind of an old practice, I think, but now you can just paste it. Now if I were to go to my other map, I can paste this right into the level. Since I'm copying something from the Kismet 2, I'm going to need to save that in a different notepad, but I'm going to grab this whole thing right here. We'll even grab this actually. I'm going to copy that. I hit Control C, and I'm actually going to get a new notepad open, and I'm going to paste that into there. Now we can just exit this map and go back to the one we were just using. And since I've already got it on the notepad, I can paste the Recon in. I can just hit paste here. Now you can see it's got everything from Kismet, but you can see here it's like where's this at? It doesn't know where it's at because it's not in the map yet. So we'll go back to what we just copied, the large whoa, that was awesome. The large camera. We'll go to the map itself. We can just paste this anywhere we want. Now when you click paste here, it's going to put it wherever your mouse is. If I just click paste, it's going to put it in the exact same spot it was in the other map. So depending on your map setup, that might be in a completely different area. So it kind of put it way back here. We have a very tiny map, so we'll leave it there for now. That'll make sure the flight path is hopefully correct. And what we'll do is actually switch this out. Place down our interp actor that we just copied from the other map, and now we've got it all set up. Now you cannot test Recon in the editor because if you ever try, you'll notice if you're the commander and you run up to a radio, you won't actually be able to interact with it. You can activate the radio, but you won't be able to click anything. So that's something you'll actually have to cook the map and play it in the game to try. We could also go back and then copy the Axis plane and then the Axis matinee, plug all that in. A lot of times though, when you do this copy and paste like this, sometimes you'll get the plane flying sideways and it kind of loses its path, I guess. So that's typically why I just have my planes fly straight. And to edit the path of the plane, you'd edit the matinee, which you can see here. This one's kind of an elaborate path here, but we won't get into all that on this tutorial. But if you ever want to edit a matinee or create your own, this is exactly what you could do. You could delete this and start fresh and just have your own. So that covers setting up Recon. As far as putting it into the map, there are a few settings on in the world info you'd need to set up, and mainly if you don't want Recon available as soon as the map starts, you'd have a delay. I typically leave that to 0. I think that's common practice. And then here you would need to change this. If you leave it on 0, you're just going to have infinite Recon with no cooldowns. So if I only wanted Recon every 3 minutes or something like that, I would just set the cooldown to 180. And then after every 180 seconds, it would enable again once I used it. So that covers Recon in its most basic form, and we'll move on. Okay, the next section I'm going to cover, it's several things that are all real similar, so I'll just kind of knock them all out at once. The first one, I'm going to set up spawn protection. And much like how we associated our vehicle with the spawn itself, spawn protection is the same thing. It enables and disables whenever the spawns enable and disable. So here I've set up my builder brush kind of where I want my spawn protection to be. This is what kicks on the red zones if you've ever played and you've gone maybe too far past the cap, or you were in an objective that fell and you hung out in there too long. There's different opinions on this, and we won't get into all that today, but this is how you would set it up. I've got my builder brush here, so now I need to make a spawn protection volume, which is under RO volume spawn protection. Easy enough. Alright, and it's RO volume spawn protection. We've only got one here, so we'll click on it. It's going to select it on the map. But what I want to do is select what the spawn I want protected. So I click my spawn, I hit F4. I can simply type in spawn up here, and I've got no spawn protection right now. So I'm going to assign it here with the arrow, and now it's associated with it. So it will enable and disable just as this one does too. No artillery volumes are the exact same way, so I'm not going to just repeat the steps. I'll show you. There it is, and you can have multiple no artillery volumes for a spawn. But I would build the no artillery volume with the builder brush. Typically they're smaller than spawn protection, but it prevents artillery from being marked. Or if artillery is marked and then the spawn is enabled, I'm sure you've seen it in game, it'll prevent the artillery from falling or cancel it or whatnot. So those work the exact same way. So we'll kind of wrap those up into one. The next two things I'm going to cover, they're similar, but they're different, and they're confusing because they're named so similarly. But the next thing I'm going to cover is the RO map bounds volume, which we will set up. This is what gives the map its shape, like in the overhead map. This is going to mark the entire area of your map, not necessarily inbounds or out of bounds, but it's going to mark the area that's displayed in the overhead map. It's going to kind of control how things on the map are plotted, so ammo points, stuff like that, make sure they display correctly in relation to the player, things like that. But let me make a little bit bigger brush this time. Let's just do 10. Whoops. Couldn't mess this up any worse. Alright, and then we'll just keep the Z at 1000. We're going to just kind of center it, I guess, where everything is. But once we place this down, you'll be able to see it. The overhead map will actually display correctly. Typically, I like to put mine a little above the terrain, the playing area. I've ran into some issues. If I leave it down like this and it's actually like encompassing the whole map, occasionally I've ran into issues where when you go to play the map in the game, you'll call artillery and you'll hear it. It'll say it's falling, but it never actually hits the ground. And after some troubleshooting, I discovered that having this too close to the playing area can sometimes interfere with it. So I've seen maps have it quite high above, but we'll try it about right there for now. Maybe a little lower, but we'll leave it right there for now. That is the RO. Oh, I didn't make it yet, did I? That's the builder brush. It's the RO volume map bounds, not to be confused with boundary. So these were named so well that and several people get them confused. I usually have to check every map I make to make sure I don't switch them. But map bounds is the single large square. You want this to be a square. If you make it a weird shape, you're going to have a weird overhead map with some missing texture areas and whatnot. So the map itself doesn't need to be square, but this does. And you can compensate for areas that aren't accessible in the overhead map itself when you make that later on. But we'll keep that like that. I'm just going to save it real quick. Alright, and we will get back to the map bounds volume in just a minute when we do the really rough overhead map. I'll show you. First, real quick before we get to that though, I want to show you the difference between map bounds and map boundaries. So once again, I'm going to go to my builder brush. What do we have this? 10,000 or so. So we can set this up to be our map boundary, and this can be any size, and it applies to both teams. So this is where we want players to not go. So if I were to set up the map boundary here, I could get right up to here, but once I got inside this volume, I'm going to get the red screen, coward, return to the front type thing. When you're making these, one thing you want to remember, don't make them, obviously it needs to be on the ground, but don't make them too short to the fact where someone could run through it. And I'm sure you've seen there's been instances of that on several maps. If someone has enough time, whatever the timer is, 8 seconds or whatever, to run all the way through this, once they get here, they're out of the red zone, and now they can do whatever they want. They could run all the way down here, they could shoot through here, they could run back through here. So if the map bounds and kind of same thing with spawn protection are too small, then they're not really doing you any good. So usually you want them to be long enough that no one's going to be able to run through it. There's really no harm in making it like way over the top big. Having it come way out here isn't gonna harm anything, and it's gonna make sure that it does the trick. And then you'd probably want another one. Now, the one other thing, these don't automatically enable. You can turn them on and off in Kismet, but typically once they're on, they're on. So you just need to turn them on. And then one last thing to do before we enable it, we need to actually create it. So we're still in the builder brush here. So we'll go to RO volume map boundary, and I'm gonna get this thing out of the way. And there's your map boundary. It's like a light orange color, and you can always, I probably didn't mention this, but you can change the color of your brushes. Each brush has its own default color, but if we wanted to make this another color, I do this for the spawn protection a lot of times. If I want my allies spawn protection to be blue, if I want to be able to glance at it quickly and see, and then I got my access is red or something like that. So we can make this any color we want, but let's say we want the map boundaries to be that color. This particular one is, we can have different colors too, but we've got it selected. So we'll go to our Kismet, which is right here. We've got Enable Map Boundary, which can be found under New Action and Enable Map Boundary. We've already got one placed here. We'll attach this here, and you can attach multiple map boundaries to one. So usually I will enable them all at once in the beginning, and then call it a day and just leave them on there. So I'm going to put that out of the way. So that enables that map boundary. So that side of the map is kind of covered. And just remember, the map bounds has nothing to do with where players can and can't go. It's more or less mapping out the map for the overhead texture, which I'm going to show you real quick. Setting up your overhead map. This is usually one of the very last things you'll do, simply because when you take a screenshot of your map, you want everything to be there that's going to be in the overhead view. So I will just show you how I do it. There are a couple of tutorials online on how to do this, and I am just going to show you how I do it, and you can take it or leave it. But what I'd usually do is I'd go into this overhead view. I've got, I think, everything turned off. Make sure your terrain's on. We don't have the lighting built on this map. Normally I would suggest building the light before you did this. If you click this G right here, this is called game view, and what it does is it turns off all this junk, so you just see kind of what you would see if you were flying around the map in the game view. So if I click it, it also automatically enables lit mode. So if I click game, it's going to kick me into lit mode. So this is how I do it. It's a little bit of finesse. I get my snipping tool ready. There it is. Oh, this mouse is horrible. I get my snipping tool ready. I don't actually want to be in game mode quite yet because I need to know exactly where my map bounds are. Everything else I don't really care about. But I'm going to zoom it in as close as I can get to get that map bounds filling up the window here. And this is not an exact science. Some of you may have a better way to do this. Feel free to chime in. But I'm going to align this up with something here so I know where it is. So that's that line there. My snipping tool. I'm going to put my snipping tool here at the top corner so I know. Because this red box isn't going to be here when I drag it. But I know I'm going to drag it from the corner of this to here. And then this is the part I kind of eyeball. I know how high I need to get. If you get this wrong, you can always redo it. It's not the end of the world. Normally, if you get it wrong, you'll notice it when you're playing, and you're like, oh, I should be, bumping into a wall here, but I'm not because the map's a little off or whatever. It doesn't affect gameplay; it just affects where the players are on the map. So, anyways, I'm going to click into game mode. We see where we're at, and I'm going to select something. Actually, that's not. This is kind of the trick too. I want to unselect the map bounds there. There we go. Okay. And we kind of remember where it was because of how we had it. So I'm just going to start here. I'm going to go down to that G line. This is how wide it was. If I do this correctly, my screenshot should be close to square, which is what the map bounds is. So we'll just call this, I'm usually going to save it to my desktop or whatnot, and we'll just call it test map overhead. This is a PNG I saved it as. Now what we'll do is we'll open up that in, I don't know if this works if I leave that window, we'll see. We'll open that up in Photoshop, and now first thing I'm going to do is this needs to be 1024 by 1024. As you can see, we're fairly close, and maybe it should have been a little bit longer, I guess, but for our purposes here, this is fine. So we want it to be 1024 by 1024, and it needs to be either like a PNG or I almost use exclusively Targas. So we've got it here. This is where you could add the name of the map, or which actually let's just do that for fun here. We'll add the name of the map. You could put, your name, just anything you see on it. A compass rose if you wanted to. Then typically what I do is maybe in the description I can include a link to like a template for these, because you could put grid lines and you could put a layer of like old paper over it to make it look like a map, like you see in the game and stuff like that. And then usually what I do is I'm going to black out the areas where the player can't go. You'll see different maps, especially some of the custom maps, people do it differently. But that's kind of the way I've done it lately, with a white border around the playable area, just to keep things very simple and easy to see. So yeah, usually I'll put the name of the map and maybe the author's name, something like that. But anyways, we'll save this, like I said, as a Targa. I'm trying to think if there's any other. We don't need an alpha channel in here, so we're just gonna, it's a 24-bit Targa. Now we need to actually import this back in to the map. You can close all that. We're going to click our import button. I don't think we've covered anything about importing yet. We'll go to the desktop. We're going to import test map overhead TGA. If we didn't have it in a power of 2, like say it was 1024 by 1020 or something, we get an error when we tried to import it. So if we start what we need to do is save it, and this kind of covers how to import things to your map without making a separate package to go along with the map. Keep it all in one. Here's the name of our map, te-test map. So if we want to save this to the maps package, we type in the exact same thing here. You can also just start to type test, and if I hit the down key, boom, it's going to find my map or whatever I'm typing. If we want to, we don't have any groups, do we? Oh yeah, we did do this, didn't we, for Destructibles? You know, if we want textures or something like that, we can just make a new one. Here's where we would name it, which we don't really need to. You can name it whatever you want. The only other setting you really need to change, the LOD group needs to be changed to texture group UI, because this is part of the UI. It's not like an in-game texture is going to appear. If you don't change it to UI, I think it's like really blurry and it won't look right. Everything else can remain the same. We'll hit OK. It will import it to the maps package, as you can see here, te-test map. Here it is here. This is going to appear as a texture if you need to narrow it down. Then what we'll do, and if I had it in thumbnail view, you could see it. So there's our map texture. It's 1024 by 1024. You go up to World Properties. You can type in overhead or texture, or overhead map texture. We're going to plug it in right there. We're going to save it. Remember too, if you import anything to your maps package and then save it without using it anywhere in the map itself, the garbage collector is going to remove it. So you have to re-import it. So yeah, we wanted to assign it to World Properties before we saved, or we would have had issues. We'll do a quick test to see if this worked. Okay, I can just spectate and see. So it looks like everything worked fairly well, and right on top of that Zis gun. Let me actually spawn in so we can see the objective, and that gave me an idea for the next tutorial. Maybe we can cover the objective borders. So as you can see here, the transport appears on here, and this is all automatic. So the map, the scale seems to be right. I mean, it's close enough. I'm bumping into this here, and that's where I am on the map. Our radio was over here, floating up in the air, I guess. But like I said, we can't use it. This is what happens when you try to use it. But yeah, that's working. And then our objective, I think we disabled that gun, didn't we? Our objective's up here. Everything seems to be working all right. So that's how you make the overhead map, import it, and then set up your map boundaries too. So that's going to conclude this tutorial. Covered quite a bit, and I'll try to trim it down in the editing so it's not so wordy. But that should cover just about everything this time, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.